the notion of European integration, David, you say the United States needs to speak up. Where is Europe in this? It really struck me a week or so ago when President Yanukovych went to Brussels that the president of the European Council congratulated him on how well things are going in Ukraine and the stability that he's brought to Ukraine specifically because of the majority in the Rada. No mention that the majority was put together in an unconstitutional manner. So I'm wondering, I mean, if one of our focuses is European integration, and President Yanukovych has said that he wants to integrate, do the things we're talking about even matter to the Europeans? I mean, after that statement.
Well, I mean, first of all, we should challenge that statement because I think looking at the reality on the ground, I don't see if the Ukrainians were interested in excuse me, if the Ukrainians were interested in European integrations, and I think they're interested in the slogan, although I'm not sure that they're interested in actually creating channels to integrate, even though I believe President Yanukovych did say something about, well, we're going to take it slowly, we're going to do it step by step, but the focus should be on creating in Ukraine the kind of society that can integrate with Europe. Well, this sounds like a lot of words, but when you look at the reality, what are they actually doing in order to bring about that integration? There was a position for, as one of the vice prime ministerships in the previous administration was dedicated to European integration. That is now, that position has now been demoted. I believe there is now a vice prime minister for the European Football Cup of 2012. Well, that's very nice, but I don't think it's quite the same as European integration on all of the other aspects, fascinating as the soccer championship may be to a lot of people in Ukraine. When you look at what's going on with the Constitution, there is the Venice Commission. I haven't seen any sort of arrangements within Ukraine to be communicating with the Venice Commission on all of the various changes that people keep on talking about. And just recently there's been some discussion on, oh, well, the political reform that we agreed to in 2004 is obviously not working. That was to bring in more of a separation of powers between the cabinet and the presidency. There is now discussion that they don't really think that that's worked, so maybe we should go back to the previous system, which was really the system of the Kuchma presidency, a sort of strengthened presidency, super presidency, if you want to call it that. Even in the area of education, there's the Bologna process, which Ukraine signed on to, and Ukraine is definitely moving in the opposite direction. It's planning to reduce the school years from 12 years to 11. The system of integrating the sort of high school exams, which was perceived as being a good thing for Ukraine, is now being abolished or dissolved. So I don't see where Ukraine, if indeed the aim is to integrate into Europe, I don't see Ukraine making any moves to do that, in addition to all of the other items on which Ukraine is backsliding right now. But I don't think that was actually what you asked me, Robert, so apologies.
Well, I mean, I'm just wondering, does the backsliding and the things that you have mentioned, can we take the mention made to Yanukovych in Brussels by the President of the European Council? Is that a broad felt European view? You can do all this backsliding and we'll praise you because we're going to salute the Statue of Stability, and you seem to have brought stability. I mean...
Well, again, maybe this is a question more for David. What are the Europeans really thinking?
I think the problem is actually a little worse in this respect. The comments by officials in Brussels during Yanukovych's last visit suggests to me that they're not paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine, and that there is a declining interest in Ukraine. That, I think, is a more disturbing problem, less than whether they're giving Yanukovych a pass or not. I think the biggest challenge Ukraine faces, that we in the West face, is a lack of attention from the West. Officials, leaders in the West need to decide whether Ukraine matters or not. We're never going to have an ideal situation in Ukraine, at least for a foreseeable future. The previous government was far from ideal. They screwed up plenty of things. The expectations that came with the Orange Revolution and Yushchenko, he never lived up to them. Maybe they were unrealistic to begin with, but there was such disappointment at how short they came up that wasn't an ideal government either. But Ukraine is a country with 46 million people in a key position in Europe, the developments in which will have a huge impact on the neighboring states. It is one of the big missing pieces of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And the West needs to decide that Ukraine matters, and it needs to roll up its sleeves. And in Europe's case in particular, Europe needs to get more serious about visa liberalization, free trade, and eventual membership in the European Union. Now, it takes nothing away from Nadia's points, which is there's an onus on the Ukrainian side, too, to get serious about this. It's a two-way street. But if there's the prospect of integration in Europe, serious prospect, then there is greater incentive for Yanukovych and the government and the parliament and everyone else to look toward Europe. But if their perception is that the door is essentially closed, then whatever incentive there might be out there to engage in the necessary reforms is removed. So the comments worry me in the sense that people simply aren't paying attention. And I think that's been the case for a while. We in the West can always find excuses not to engage with Ukraine. We've had plenty over the years. At a certain point, though, we just have to suck it up and realize that this country matters and that we have to get more serious about dealing with it. Put NATO to the side. NATO's a different issue. NATO's a divisive issue. It would be unhealthy to insert it into the debate now. President Yanukovych's position on this is clear. There's not support among the Ukrainian population. We're talking about the European Union and about becoming a member of Europe. And that, I think, is something that's very important for Europeans to maintain for Ukraine and for Ukrainians to be able to aspire to.
Well, David, do you see any leaders or countries within the European Union that you make the comment, I think very valid one, that most people seem to evidence that they're not paying attention in what they're saying and doing? Are there exceptions within the European Union?
I think the newest members of the European Union are the exceptions. The Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, Estonians, the Czechs as well. So the newer members are more interested in this. Geography obviously has a lot to do with that. History has a lot to do with that too. For other members of the EU, Ukraine is so far away that they don't really follow it. And for others, there is the case of Russia, where they worry that trying to deepen ties with Ukraine will come at the expense of their relationship with Russia, and they don't want to damage their ties with Moscow. For those governments and those countries, I would argue we have to get away from viewing Ukraine through a Russia prism. We have to understand that having good relations with Russia is understandable, but having good relations and deeper ties with Ukraine is just as important. In Ukraine, there is, I think, the prospect of having closer ties. There really is, I think, the hope there. But these countries need to get more serious. I worry that there is a sense in Europe that they think the new Ukrainian government has made its decision, and therefore we can wash our hands of Ukraine. That, to me, would be the very wrong conclusion to draw.
Just wanted a couple more comments on that. I think the issue of European integration really is a very important one for Ukraine. Because, as David pointed out, the issue of NATO is now off the table, despite the fact that actually during the Yushchenko administration that actually could have been a very real prospect. There are member states that did join NATO with far less support than there was in Ukraine at the time. But for the very sort of specific reasons of political infighting in Ukraine and the lack of institutions and the lack of governmental support to spread those messages in Ukraine and actually to make that final push while there was still some ability in the West to accept that bringing Ukraine in and giving them a map, which was actually the thing that was on the table at the time. It's regrettable that some of these items were not institutionalized, not consolidated during the Yushchenko government. But given that that's off the table now, we're now in a position where the Yanukovych administration is saying things about, yes, we are moving towards Europe, but at our own pace and on our own terms and so on. And I think that this is really what we have to work with, and I think this really is an area where the United States can play a role together with Europe to try and identify the terms and conditions and to creating an environment to bring Ukraine in. I wish that there were more forums really where Western Europe and the United States could discuss some more of these things, because we have there are a couple of instruments, the Eastern Partnership, for example, which I think is sort of somewhat useful, but that was really pushed through by Poland and Sweden, mentioning a new member, and also Sweden that was also behind this. But that puts Ukraine in the context of, well, together with Georgia, but also with Azerbaijan, Moldova, Belarus, and the other Caucasus states, and I think that's really not very helpful. And from what I've heard recently, the funding for those efforts really is beginning to dwindle, and the political will in Brussels is beginning to dwindle on that. I think the United States should find a way not only to engage with Ukraine, but also to engage with Europe on these issues, because I think we still have a door that's somewhat open. And I think we should grasp that and try to work out how we can work together with the Europeans to bring Ukraine in.
Just add to, I think I'm glad Nadia mentioned Sweden. I would also add Finland is another country that's been supportive. I think the Scandinavians have been very good on this. But coming back also to your original question, Bob, I think there is this tendency in the West, the United States as well, to view what's happening in Ukraine as a stabilizing of the situation. And in viewing it that way, since we're with the Democracy and Governance Task Force, I think there is this tendency to accept this cutting of corners on what's happening. Whether going back from, I mean, the election. I think both Nadia and I were there. My sense, and being with we were both with IRI's delegation, was that it was a decent election. I don't think either of us has questions that Yanukovych won at the end of the day. But events subsequent to that, as you mentioned, the formation of the coalition, done on a basis that, despite the Constitutional Court's ruling, seemed to have been unconstitutional. The ramming through of the Kharkiv deal on the gas Black Sea Fleet exchange, the postponement of local elections, and the pressure on journalists and media organizations, the proposal to rearrange how Kiev itself is arranged and organized. There are a lot of issues here that raise concerns, or should raise concerns, in the West. But I worry that officials in the West are viewing a united government, which is something new in Ukraine for a change, is a positive, and as a result they're giving them a pass on these serious shortcomings on democracy. I think that's a mistake. Yanukovych's support is already declining, and sort of looking the other way while the government cuts these corners inevitably is going to come back and haunt you. And so I think we have to be careful about not associating ourselves too much with that.